for the state, counsel for the defense. The defendants are present. State, this was your motion, or you had a challenge. I'm assuming you are moving to exclude him.
I'm moving to exclude him completely, Judge, and I want to make the argument that, I don't know if you are a Jon Stewart fan, he signed off last night, and I didn't see it last night because I was getting ready for trial, but I saw it this morning, and his sign-off was, and I will say it less colorfully than Jon Stewart said, there is BS out there, is what he said, but he used the real words, and he said, when you smell it, you need to call somebody on it, and that's what this is. This man is part of the problem and not part of the solution for police officers. He is going around training officers to shoot first, and he'll come in and defend their conduct, that it's okay to shoot people in the back, it's okay to shoot unarmed people, and then is also training investigators to let them have a couple days so they can get online and look up his stuff to figure out what you say to defend yourself in a proceeding. And he has never been qualified, and I understand he's been let into a lot of courts, but a lot of the criminal cases he's testified in, Judge, too, are secret grand jury proceedings. He's brought in to sort of whitewash when a police shoots somebody, to come in and explain in a secret grand jury, let me tell you about how this shooting was justified based on my research about why they shot him in the back, and then it comes out of the grand jury and no police officer is indicted as a result of his testimony, and no one gets to see what he's doing, and he's been doing it in secret in his criminal cases for a while now. This man should be stopped here in New Mexico. He is not qualified by training. This whole idea that there is nowhere in the world other than at his university and his program a police psychology degree that does not involve clinical psychology. All the other police psychologists and the degrees for police psychology are for giving clinical training to police officers. Finally, in New Mexico, we've got a rule. You can't come in here and say you're a psychologist unless you're licensed somewhere. He's licensed nowhere. He's licensed nowhere. And even though he's giving opinions on these studies, he's holding himself out as a police psychologist here, and I think it is wrong to allow him to testify based on education, which I think is deficient, and based on the self-serving research that he has done over and over again that does not have scientific standards that he complies with, and much worse, has this whole issue of confirmation bias. It is obvious he is biased in favor of the police just by the fact that most of his publications, and most of the ones that Mr. Robles went over except for one or two yesterday, are all published in police magazines, and that's not peer review. This is exactly like the experts that the tobacco industry developed to come in and say smoking doesn't cause cancer. This is exactly the same thing, Judge. And he's been going around the country doing the same thing, and I would ask the court to stop him here. If the court is not willing to, and I also, well, on the flip side, Judge, I also understand this is a preliminary hearing, and I understand the court can listen to evidence and disregard what it thinks is not believable. And if you are concerned about an appellate issue, I also understand that if you allow him to testify just to get through the prelim, my request would be that you limit him very strictly just to reaction time and his research on reaction time, and none of this hogwash about attention span, or the police officer can't remember what happened or what he's focused on. That all of that is just hogwash, as indicated by the psychologist who came up with the term inattentional blindness, says you just cannot use it in a real life setting or in a courtroom, because it just is invalid, because you can't tell whether the police officer really didn't see it or is just saying he didn't see it. So that's my argument, Judge. Thanks.
Mr. Bregman, any comments?
Your Honor, just that I think that any criticisms of this work that was brought out was not specific to what he's going to testify to today. The work that he's going to, the issues that he's going to testify today to, there was no criticism. I think that came out. I also don't know that calling this all a hogwash is just enough by argument. I haven't heard the evidence to support that this is all hogwash. To the contrary, the government said that a few people have criticized this, just like everybody that does work, it's criticized. I also don't believe just because he trains police officers means that somehow he is biased or untruthful, just like the other police officers that have come in here and will continue to come in here in this hearing and talk about training. Just because they are police officers doesn't mean they're biased about the training. So with all that said, I think this goes to weight and not admissibility.
Mr. Robles?
The proffer was very narrow. I did not ask for the court to accept this witness as a witness or an expert in all of psychology. Again, it was a very narrow focus because the focus of his testimony is actually very narrow. I asked about human action and reaction. In the the cross-examination, you did not hear those words asked by the state because there wasn't any criticism of Dr. Lewinsky's studies on action and reaction. Again, we also asked Dr. Lewinsky, have there been any criticisms? And there were none. And I think that that's the most telling thing, that the focus of our inquiry is an area in which there has not been criticism. And again, we're focused on two studies, and I identified them for the court, and if the court would like me to restate them, I will. Now, in the cross-examination, there was criticism of other studies. There was no criticism in the form of a question being asked about the studies that are being relied upon in this particular
And
matter.
those studies go to the action-reaction time?
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
So it's action, reaction, and then there's this notion of inattentional blindness. That's not what we're going to ask this witness about. The one question that will be asked is essentially, how does stress affect the time it takes to make a decision? So our focus is ridiculously narrow. I have to say that I've crafted the examination to essentially talk about human factors, that is, how much time it takes to take certain actions. And from that, certain conclusions could be drawn. It's not going to be testimony about an officer's state of mind, what an officer does or does not remember. So this frontal assault on Dr. Lewinsky missed what we want this witness to testify about. And for that reason, Your Honor, there has been no evidence given to the court that challenges the reliability or the validity of the studies upon which his opinions will be given. And as a result, we would like the court to allow this witness to continue to testify about the foundations of his research, the two articles that we're going to talk about, explain what those articles mean, and then apply them to this case.
All right, thank you. Well, let me tell all of you that some of my concerns is, and I asked the witness to please try to separate the areas as much as possible, because I'm trying to determine which area of his testimony is certainly relevant to the case and would be helpful for me, being the trier of the fact as well. You all know the rule. I mean, do they have some sort of specialized knowledge or training, and would that information help the trier of fact in the case? That's basically the rule itself. My understanding here was that I think after Mr. Robles had initially spoke, that there were going to be 3 or 4 areas, and that was going to be officer perception, action, reaction time, and then the one of memory and legal force encounter. First of all, let me take the last one. The memory and legal force in encounters, I just listening, I think that's a little bit on the speculative side. I don't think that it would necessarily assist me in this case in making a decision when we're talking about memory. So I don't think that would be helpful. So I'm going to exclude that particular area, because I don't think it would be helpful to me in making a decision in this case. With respect to officer perception, again, I think that listening, that's one of high speculation, at least from what I garnered, and I'm going to exclude that one as well, because I don't feel it would assist me. What I do feel that is certainly relevant and that would assist me is the action-reaction time. As all of you know, one of the issues here is how long did it take for the defendants to make a determination based upon Mr. Boyd's actions to decide whether or not to shoot in this case. And I think the if there's any testimony that helps guide me in making that determination as to how much time it takes to react under a stressful situation, that would certainly help me in making a decision. And I would ask that we keep it as narrow as possible to that particular area, because that's the area that I find that is the most relevant to helping me make a decision. Now, I know that the state brought out some other issues about the way the degree was obtained and an allegation of, perjury and all these, some other things. I take those as to the weight of his testimony, and that will certainly go to the credibility. And like I judge the credibility of all the witnesses in this case, I'll give it whatever merit I feel it merits, and that goes with all the witnesses as well. So with that,
I would just ask for a simple clarification, if that's all right, Your Honor. One of the studies, the one that was not challenged, and again, I'm sort of taking the essence of it, the effect of stress on the time it takes to make a decision. So it is human factors, and I just wanted to be sure that in asking about human action and reaction and the time those, that it takes to do certain things, that's within the ambit of the court's ruling.
Mr. Robles, and I'm going to try to make it as clear as I can. From my perspective, I think what's relevant for me to understand is when an individual is in a stressful situation, what sort of effect does it have on the individual to make a determination or decision and then to act on that decision? That's what the court feels is relevant information.
Very well, Your Honor.
Okay, sir. If you want to, yes.
I just want to put on the record that Mr. Robles has acknowledged this is a human factors issue, and Mr. Lewinsky said that he has no training in human factors, none, zero, zip. But I understand the court's ruling, and I've got it. Thank you, Judge.
All right, thank you. You can go ahead and have your witness come back in, and if you would please advise him what I've ruled on, and try to keep your questioning to that area.
If you mind.
Yes, sir.
Okay. May it please the court?
Yes.
Before we discuss your work, the studies you have done, I would like for you to talk to us about the foundations of your research. And I'd like to begin with when did the scientific study of human behavior begin?
Actually, some scientific comments on it in about the year 1000 in Persian documents. The first psychological lab dealing with action and reaction was created by Helmholtz, and I'm quoting from Introductory to Psychology textbooks, in 1848, well, it's before that, with publications in 1848 and 1852 on simple reaction. More complicated reaction was Donder's work in 1870 or so to about 1890. So it's really, there's about 150 years of research on action and reaction elements in a variety of different areas.
What are some well-known examples of human perception and contextual influence research?
You can simply look at any intersection right out here. The reason we have amber before we get to a red on a regular stop sign is to advise people that they're about to need to stop, because no one can stop anything immediately. And an example of a decision-making, very simple decision-making, is, let's say you're entering the intersection and the light turns amber. Do you go or stop? And how long will that take, and where will you be? And that's a go, no-go decision. So very simple context of action or reaction elements. You see somebody crossing a street. But probably more, an example more people are aware of are sports analogies, where they see action all the time, how long it takes to swing and hit a ball, how long it takes to commit to intercept another football player on a line, the effect of a fake, not being able to stop within time's effect. Fakes work because once people commit themselves to something, their ability to stop immediately is impaired. And every time you see a fake in athletics, it's the very same elements of action, reaction, starting and stopping.
How much time have you devoted to studying the human perception studies that have preceded you?
A significant portion of my time, both within the academic community and also in my personal application, which is traditional martial arts, which this stuff pervades traditional martial arts.
Now, how well does your research on human perception contextual influences correlate with the findings made by other researchers in analogous areas of inquiry?
It correlates very highly. If we look at other people, for instance, Vickers has a textbook out, Perception, Cognition, and Decision Training, in which he looks at reaction time in whether it's kinesthetic reaction time. In other words, if you're touched, how quickly can you react? Auditory reaction time, and then visual reaction time, because visual reaction time is the slowest just because of the cognitive processing issues. Vickers' works she quotes a variety of research which says the fastest reaction time on average to a visual cue is about 19 100ths of a second, just under a fifth of a second, to about 23 100ths of a second. When we put a gun in people's hands, they have more complicated sort of reaction process. We extend that time by 2 100ths of a second.
Maybe this is a point in which I should have you explain, what is this concept known as action-reaction? What is an explanation that would help the court understand that?
Well, everything we respond to is, in essence, a stimulus that we are reacting to. Action is the stimulus, whether it's someone charging at us, someone drawing a knife, someone pointing a gun, someone throwing a ball. That's considered an action element, or in our case, some of our laboratory studies, it's a light going on. And then you measure reaction, which is a person's response to that. And there's a variety of more complicated process. You look at simple, complex reaction, reaction requiring decision-making, simple decision-making, more complex decision-making. So it's a variety of different types of reaction that you're engaged in studying.
If your research on human perception and contextual influence has reached similar conclusions to the research in analogous areas, why is some of your research sometimes called landmark?
Well, for instance, we worked with Joan Vickers, bought her the latest eye scan equipment, and took her into the police world. She'd done work before on shooting and sighting with biathlon athletes, and she'd done work on eye scan work with Olympic athletes. In fact, she trained the women's hockey team, the goalie for the women's hockey team that won the Salt Lake City Olympics. And also, anyway, she's done a lot of work with professional athletes and Olympic athletes. And we brought her into the police world where we applied her concepts of studying eye scan in the police world and dynamics in the police world. That's why it's groundbreaking. It is based on human behavior to the extent that police officers are humans. Even though they have some training, the training is not quite that of a professional athlete even. And so we're still looking at how they perform as human beings within a particular type of encounter. The groundbreaking is that we're applying that research to the police world.
How long has reaction time been researched?
Well, as I said, about 150 years for reaction time, although it was noted over 1,000 years ago.
Okay. Please explain how your research is based upon the work of many scientists who have studied human behavior.
Well, we certainly are building on the work of Helmholtz and Donder, and we're not of that caliber, of course, but we're certainly using their work. The Gestalt psychologists over 100 years ago started looking at context, how context and expectation primed a response, facilitated a response, or impaired a response. So there's literally generations of researchers that have preceded us that we are just taking the research concepts and starting to look at how police officers respond with their particular tools.
From what source did you obtain the methodologies you use in your studies about action-reaction?
Well, for instance, we used an elementary decision model called go-no-go decision making. It was created in the early 50s as a method for measuring the simplest decision making time possible. Go, no go, for instance, one light comes on, you go, two lights come on, you don't go. Most people react in a very simple fashion. What they measure, for instance, an Olympic athlete starting with a gun going off. That reaction time would change if they really had to confirm it was a particular gun versus a gun of another caliber. Very simple confirmatory decision process, but it's called a go, no-go model. That model was created in the 50s as a way to study very quick decision making and the effect of patterns and the evolution of patterns. That was created in British Columbia. Several universities in British Columbia created that. It's evolved now in a very complicated, sophisticated format, but it's one of the examples of how our work is based on the work of others. And certainly it's based on Donder's and Helmholtz.
How thoroughly have the methodologies you used in your action-reaction studies been tested for reliability and validity?
Well, it's consistent. People responding to a light. In fact, you could, if you want to today, you could go onto the internet and you could look at response times based on sounds, and you simply have to press a keyboard, which is what most computer tests of reaction time are. So there'll be a sound and you press a key. Or you could look at visual reaction time. For instance, an illustration we use in our classes is the sheep visual reaction time study, in which you have to press a key on a computer once you see sheep begin to move. It's more complex than simply a light coming on. It involves some sense of judgment, and you'll find that's a longer time than. So these are very common methods, and they're well illustrated in work done by universities and elsewhere, whether it's mostly in athletics or in simple reaction time.
What has the peer review process shown about the reliability and validity of the methodologies you use in your action-reaction studies?
Well, it certainly is accepted as a peer-reviewed methodology.
Now, I'd like to review some of the terminology you may use during your testimony. First, I'd like to ask you to define perception.
Well, perception is a sensory response, whether it's visual or auditory or kinesthetic or olfactory. It's a sensory response to a particular stimulus. So there's perception. The stimulus is perceived, and then the brain interprets that stimulus as something that someone needs to respond to.
Now, what is action-reaction time?
Well, those are the measurements of action and the measurements of reaction. That's all. How long does it take to do an action, and how long does a reaction take to occur?
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, for instance, in our study, we use simple LED lights. There's a variety of those action-reaction elements. A very simple illustration is in baseball, in which the pitcher throws a ball. The ball takes about 4 to 5 tenths of a second to travel from the pitcher's mound to home plate. Within that time span, the batter has to perceive the ball. They usually have some prearranged knowledge, the game, the pitcher, the way the ball is held. They have some prearranged knowledge, some context that influences their judgment. But then the ball is thrown, the pitcher throws a ball, the batter perceives a ball, makes a judgment, and then initiates a motor movement. So that's an example of the elements that we will be looking at.
What is motor movement time?
Motor movement time is the time it takes somebody to do something. For instance, a batter swinging a bat, the illustration I used, may range from 18/100ths to a quarter of a second, maybe 28/100ths of a second, based on whether it's university, a semi-pro, or pro. It is the duration of time it takes someone to initiate a movement and finish it. Within those motor movements, there's 2 types. There's open loop and closed loop, and I'm quoting from the work of Dick Schmidt, who just retired as a professor of psychology at UCLA. Schmidt talks about closed loop being an initiation of movement that is affected by information coming back in. And an open loop is a reaction that just happens. It usually takes place in a quarter of a second or less. And it's not influenced by anything that goes on. It just is finished because there's no time for feedback.
Would you please give us an example of a closed loop system?
Well, a closed loop system might be, in martial arts, if I'm striking very slowly towards somebody and they go to do a counter movement, I can then react to that. I can counter that. Or if an athlete initiates a fake way ahead of time, that fake won't affect me because I can move and then see their action and then respond accordingly. So that's closed loop. I'm taking action in and perception rather, and then changing what I'm doing in relation to it. That takes time. An open loop is just the speed with which something can occur that then is completed regardless of what happens.
What is processing or decision method? What is processing or decision method and decision time?
Well, we're really looking at how, and we can explain it neurophysiologically or cognitively. It's basically the brain or the mind processing the stimulus and making a decision about whether or not to respond or not. And that processing of what is perceived and then an appropriate action really occurs at a variety of different levels.
Okay. What's an example of processing and decision method and decision time?
Well, for instance, a very common and a well-measured processing is a pilot taking off and whether or not they have reached takeoff speed and have to take off, or they can stop the plane in an emergency and slow it. There's a critical decision point there in which the pilot, if something occurs, the pilot will follow through with something or be able to stop. That's a go, no-go decision in a real-world situation where there's some element of decision process.
Okay. What is memory?
There's a variety of memory. There's short-term, long-term memory. There's working memory. But memory is basically how what occurs is stored in some fashion in our process. Memory is really a storing of information.
Would you please provide us with an example of how memory is affected by stress?
Well, for instance, in our study that was just published, we looked at the effect of active officers and observer officers. We found a significant difference in stress between the active officers and the observer officers, measured by pulse and also measured by, we were looking particularly at interbeat variability. If your pulse is, well, if we monitor a pulse of somebody in this room, it is fluctuating based on thoughts, based on movement. It's always variable within a given time span. But under the influence of adrenaline, pulse becomes very regular, very high and very regular, indicating stress. So we were looking at cardiac measures, self-reports, a variety of different issues, and we found that active officers who had to respond to a threat in this very extended situation, we had a gun pointed at them, they responded. During the time the gun was pointed, their pulse doubled. Their ability to perceive information was significantly reduced compared to that of our controls, which were observing officers, particularly around the presence of the gun. As they began to shift their response to their own, what they were doing, their attentional process, and the stress level seemed to impair their ability to clearly see what was going on. In the police world, that used to be known as tunnel vision, tunnel hearing. We now call it different terms, more professional terms.
Your Honor, excuse me, I think he's getting into what officer perception is, and I think that was
I
pulled up
agree.
by the court. I move to strike.
Okay. Now, I'd like to talk about your academic research on reaction time. What does the academic literature say generally about the basic cognitive processes involved in stopping a continuous action?
Well, when we get a continuous action, or serial movement is what it's called in motor areas, which is part of a subcategory of psychology and human performance areas in psychology, it says that human beings take some period of time to stop doing what they are doing, a la the amber light. In fact, in one of the first studies I did in experimental psychology in 1964-65 was to have somebody tap their finger on the table as quickly as they could, a person to say go and then stop, and somebody else measured the number of taps the average student made after somebody said stop. Because we have a tendency, once we initiate a go signal, to continue that go signal until a stop signal interferes with it.
Let me ask very specifically, what do you mean by go signal and stop signal?
Well, we engage in motor movement, whether it's driving, whether it's punching. I don't have a knuckle here because I was punching, saw somebody's elbow come down, too late to block because the stop signal came too late, and I broke my knuckle on their elbow as they moved in to block that. I clearly saw it was going to happen, but within the 10th of a second, that's an estimate, that punch took to finish, I didn't have time to stop. There was no time for the stop signal to chase the go signal and impair that action.
What factors are known to affect the process you just described?
Complexity of the stimulus, the environment, stress, decision-making qualities, the officer's focus of attention. For instance, if they're focused on what requires them to stop, they're more likely to notice it versus focus on something else. So certainly some attentional issues are critical. Perceptual issues are critical.
How does your research that you've just described apply to the law enforcement setting?
Well, our research is, in particular, our research on starting and stopping is as pure as it can be in a laboratory situation. Stress in the real world tends to complicate that. It may make it faster. Some of our stuff we think may go faster because of that. Likely stress will slow it down. When we look at the difference between initiating a response in relation to a stimulus in our laboratory studies versus in our traffic stop studies in which we caused officers to be distracted and then pointed a weapon at them and measured the time span in that with digital imaging stuff, we found the reaction time was slower in the real world as the officer was perceiving the real world context versus a simple computer board. So it is as simple as we could make it in some of our initial studies, and then we're getting into more complex dynamic stuff later.
Now, I'd like to talk specifically about two studies you performed. The first study I'd like to talk about is entitled Police Officer Reaction Time to Start and Stop Shooting, the Influence of Decision-Making and Pattern Recognition. You're the author of that article.
Yes, with several others, including Dr. Hudson and Jennifer Dister-Heft.
Now, what did this particular study examine?
We examined 4 areas. We looked at basic, simple visual reaction time, particularly when an officer had a gun in their hand. The dynamics of holding a gun are really different than simply pressing a key. So how you hold the gun, the complexity of that kind of slows things down, as I said, by a little bit. So we looked at that. We had a particular test instrument. We had a computer program within our stimulus board, because even computers react.
Okay.
They send a stimulus out and they react, and so we used a computer board where the computer was right within the stimulus board, and then that sent a message to our computer that things had gone on, so we would not have the action-reaction time of the computer affecting the data. But we looked at speed of response in relation to a stimulus, study number 1. Study number 2, we had officers continuously fire in sequence, in serial, and they were told to stop as soon as the light went off. They didn't know when the light was to go on, when it was to go off. It was a repeat of the study I did in 1964-65, except we're using more sophisticated equipment. And we found it took officers time to stop. They could not stop immediately. Perception. In fact, another way of looking at that is stopping is the same thing as starting, except you've already engaged in a behavior that you have to put the brakes on. They're both a reaction to what is seen, except when you're starting to act, nothing is happening and you're primed to go. When you have to stop, you're engaging in action and then the stimulus comes on to stop. So it takes just a little bit longer to stop than it does to start if you're engaged in something and you're focused on doing that. So we looked at that and we found it took some time to stop. Those are consistent with everything else we're including. Why fakes occur in athletics is it takes time to stop, and you can't always react as quick as the opponent is once you commit to something. Our third study dealt with recognition of, fourth was patterns. Fourth was patterns, recognition of patterns, the evolution of patterns, dealing with.
Well, let me ask about the third experiment. What do you remember about that experiment involving simple decisions made first?
Well, our third study was really go, no go.
Okay.
We presented a stimulus, series of lights, and when one focused on, and I don't remember the exact, but the officers didn't know when. We had it randomly sampled. They didn't know when that one light would go on or 2 lights would go on, and they would have to pull the trigger, and it's a go, no-go situation. For instance, if one light came on, they pulled the trigger. 2 lights came on, they didn't. So they kind of would have to literally wait to confirm. It is the simplest type of decision-making process there is. And we found a significant delay if people had to confirm what the stimulus was.
Now, I interrupted you when you were talking about the fourth question that was asked in this experiment. I believe that was about pattern recognition, and I interrupted you. So would you please describe what you learned about pattern recognition?
Well, pattern recognition is really a reference to the concept of schemas. I made reference to Dick Schmidt, retired professor, UCLA, author of many versions of the textbook on motor learning and performance. Schmidt and I are personal acquaintances. He's worked for us. And in I think it was 1975, he was looking particularly at why athletes make quick decisions, the type of decisions that are skillful but yet don't involve what we would call frontal lobe processing, thought, actually. Batters, for instance, are reacting off a pattern of behavior. Schmidt called that schemas. So we were interested in how an officer recognized a pattern of behavior, simple pattern of lights evolving. If the pattern came on, they reacted. If the pattern didn't come on, they didn't react. And we found that the pattern was slower than a simple reaction time, but faster than a decision time by hundredths of a second, but significantly almost a tenth of a second. But if you recognize a pattern, you respond quicker to that than if you don't recognize a pattern.
To ask a little bit more about the study that was conducted, what was the sample size you used?
That particular, without looking at our pre-studies, our trial studies, that study was, I believe, was 104 officers.
Okay, why did would you please describe for the court where the study was conducted, who you chose to be involved in your sample, and how that sample was obtained?
Most of the officers were selected randomly on duty of primarily Tempe Police Department in Arizona. But we also had other officers involved, but they were mostly line officers out of Tempe. So we tried to get an average officer population. Certainly it was out of a particular department, but we thought 104 was a large enough sample that we'd certainly get quite a variance in population sample.
Now, starting with experiment number 1, what results did your study reveal?
Well, we found that everything takes time, including a time to start. And we found that the average time for an officer to begin to react to a simple light was 25 100ths of a second, 2 100ths of a second slower than Vickers. We found the trigger pull on a short stroke, light poundage, semi-automatic handgun like a Glock to take 6 100ths of a second. And that was most frequent. We have a standard deviation for that, of course, but we found 4 to 6 100ths of a second for the actual travel time of the trigger, as measured by our electronic sensors. So the total reaction time, including perception processing and this discrete motor movement time, took just about 31 100ths of a second. Now, people say decision time can go on as motor movement time is occurring, but the only indication we have of perception and response, even if it goes on after the trigger pull, is that trigger pull is really the response issue. So we're looking at 6 4 100ths of a second.
What did you learn about the time that it takes between consecutive trigger pulls during continuous action?
The cycle time of the officer in repeated trigger pulls is about 28 100ths of a second. It's a cadence that people hear on a range. It's in the realm of bang, 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 bang. So it's approximately that. We found the speed of the trigger pull was directly connected to the officer's reset of the trigger. For instance, if an officer kind of slapped the trigger pull took much longer. If an officer just let the trigger reset and pulled it in, it was much faster. We were able to measure the trigger reset. A skilled officer will have a travel time of the trigger back to break point in 4 to 6 100ths of a second, and they will have a reset time to reset point about 2 100ths of a second unless they slap the trigger. Most of the trigger time that people take on that 28 100ths of a second doesn't involve travel time of the trigger. It involves starting and stopping a linear movement on the part of an officer.
Now, what were your results from your second experiment?
On the first series of data, in other words, the first trial, the first time we had officers stop in relation to trigger pulls. They started pulling the trigger when the light went on, and when it went off, they stopped. We found that the stop time was just over 1/3 of a second. When we averaged it across all trials, and they were randomly presented, when we averaged it across all trials, the average time for officers to stop pulling a trigger was 29 100ths of a second, which means that for the average officer, they would still do 1 and possibly 2 trigger pulls after the stimulus went off in a laboratory setting.
So that's what experiment number 2 suggests, that it takes time to stop pulling the trigger once you've initially made the decision to pull the trigger.
That's correct.
And the time that takes is 0.29 seconds.
0.29 seconds across 5 trials, right, for 100 and some officers.
What were the results of your third experiment?
When we looked at the decision-making time, the one light comes on, you pull the trigger, 2 lights come in, you don't, or you reverse it. It really doesn't matter what your go stimulus is. We found the average time for officers to begin a reaction was a half a second with a trigger pull of 6/100ths of a second. Our range on that ranged from 37/100ths of a second for officers who are pulling the trigger slowly and waiting for the stimulus to go off. 37/100ths of a second. On the other side, the range went out to almost 9/10ths of a second, 87/100ths of a second for officers who are really vigorously engaged in pulling the trigger. So our average time was 56/100ths of a second with trigger pull, but we certainly got quite a range on that. Standard deviation, I think, was let's see, it was 17/100ths of a second for the standard deviation.
Let me ask, since you brought up standard deviation, why do you use standard deviation as your measure of a possible error in your study?
Well, in statistics, there are 2 ways of assessing your data. One is mean, as in our attention study, mean, median, mode, standard deviation, range, kurtosis, and skewness, and they all deal with the kind of distribution. Most data is on a bell-shaped curve of somehow, you may have seen curves of, well, you need to be able to describe that curve which describes your data set. Standard deviation is the best way to describe that data set. If you look at standard error of measurement, which is used a lot, for instance, in medical studies, they want to look at how their data compares to a theoretical overall population. So we're more concerned with describing our data. What even biological statisticians tell us is you don't report both types of data. You don't do that analysis. It's a waste of time, it's redundant. If you have standard deviation and your sample size included in your article, you can gather, for instance, a standard error of measurement or standard error of mean, because standard error of mean is your sample size over the square root of your standard deviation. So if you do standard deviation, all the data is there for standard error of mean or any other type of data. You just have to describe your sample set completely in one format or in the other. And we prefer to describe the population so people have a better idea of who we're sampling and how they did.
Now, before turning your attention back to the results of your fourth experiment, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about standard deviation. What does the number of false positives suggest in your study?
Well, what is characteristic overall of go, no-go decision-making is that officers can make errors, which is what a false positive and a false negative is. In other words, when the stimulus to go was presented, did officers react and go, or did they not go? And anytime anybody makes a decision, there's a possibility of errors. And so you get false positives, meaning they go when they're not supposed to go, or you get false negatives. They see it, they see the stimulus, and then they go, oh, I guess I should have reacted.
So what does the number of false positives in your studies suggest about the validity of your studies?
Well, it suggests that we accurately measured it, and that, by the way, is consistent. When no-go studies are done, we tend to get a slightly higher go stimulus response because people are primed to react. That's why we did our work on patterns. They expect it, and then when it appears to occur, then they jump on it.
Now, turning your attention to experiment number 4, what results did you obtain from conducting experiment 4?
Experiment number 4 was that patterns evolve. That's in particular where we got a lot of false positives and false negatives. We didn't get a lot. We got a higher percentage on our go, no-go stimulus than our other tests. And what we found was that it takes time to stop.
I'm sorry.
It takes time to stop, it takes time to start, and if you add decision-making, it takes longer. Number 4 is really very clear. Patterns help officers respond quicker by, in general, about 1/10 of a second. For instance, I think our average time with patterns was 47/100ths of a second to respond with a trigger pull. The average time for officers to respond when they had to make a simple decision was 1/10 of a second slower, 56/100ths of a second.
What were the limitations of your study?
Well, it's in a laboratory situation. We didn't have stress. We sampled 104 officers. We could have sampled 10,000, I guess. We sampled more than enough for the type of statistical analysis we were doing. We did do similar kinds of analysis with officers in a variety of different departments. We're finding that data is pretty consistent, but it is a laboratory study.
Okay. What about the use of a handgun versus a rifle? Would we consider that a limitation on your study?
Well, a rifle would complicate motor movement time. We did find that a long-barreled weapon, for instance, maneuvered in a variety of different ways, does take a bit longer to align than a handgun. But the trigger pull for most patrol rifles, AR-15s, are very similar to a trigger pull that...
Excuse me, Ron, I'm going to object because I think he said he's not qualified with ballistics or firearms. So beyond his foundation and beyond his area of expertise.
Any response?
The question is about the effect on time using a handgun versus a rifle, and there wasn't any there are no questions about ballistics or fire or anything like that. It was just simply the time that it takes for someone to use a handgun versus the time it takes to use a long-barreled weapon, and it's all about time.
Well, Judge, I think the experiment was all done with handguns and not with rifles, so I don't know how we can answer that question.
Well, I think we need some foundation so I can know whether or not there is any knowledge or expertise dealing with the rifles themselves as opposed to the handguns.
Dr. Lewinsky, would you please explain how you came to learn about the different time that it takes for someone to manipulate a handgun versus the time it takes to manipulate a shoulder-fired weapon, a long gun?
Well, experience with AR-15s dating back to early 1970s as military rifles, and till today. So I have a lot of experience with triggers on AR-15s, different types of triggers, and of course we have a lot of experience on the triggers with Glocks, but we're really looking at the length of the trigger pull and the time it takes to move a trigger that length with a particular poundage. That's a similarity. And to the extent that a trigger is light poundage and short stroked, trigger pull would be identical. It doesn't matter what the instrument is that is using it. A rifle is different to manipulate, but that's a gross motor movement. Trigger pull tends to be fine motor, and we're looking at the type of trigger, short pull, light poundage.
How did the results of your study relate to the real-life law enforcement setting?
Well, it lays down a parameter of quick response, simple response, in a clear, uncluttered situation, unaffected by emotional issues, emotional response, decision-making, etc. Now, we've looked at those in separate components. And the question becomes, how would those then move into a dynamic encounter? And that's what we've got with some of our other studies.
Now, I'd like to turn to another study that you've performed. Is it true that you authored Performing Under Pressure, Gaze Control, Decision-Making, and Shooting Performance of Elite and Rookie Officers?
Yes.
Yes. And when was that study published?
I think 2012, I think, and then presented a number of peer-reviewed conferences shortly after.
And I understand that it was published in the Human Movement Science, a kinesiology journal?
It's human movement science. It's not entirely kinesiology. They primarily work in the area of cognition and sports. And there's a lot of eye scan research in there dealing with athletes.
What did this study examine?
We examined particularly the eye scan of rookie and extremely well-trained officers. An elite counterterrorism unit, we consulted later with them in the Olympics. They were guarding royalty. During the Olympics, we consulted with them on tactics. They're a really elite unit. And we looked at regularly trained officers. We called them novices, but they were trained to the same level as officers in this country are. The study was done in the United Kingdom. We put eye scan equipment on them. We looked at the effect of eye scan on decision making and shot timing, placement, and the effect of that on overall performance of officers.
Okay. How was this study conducted?
Well, we had a scenario based on an actual encounter, so it's as close as we could possibly make it. We trained our actors with a Broadway director so that they could repeat. We wanted a live scenario to really simulate an actual encounter, and it had to be repeated a number of times. We repeated it over 140 times. And we had officers respond. We kept them apart, so it had to be a shooting decision. We kept them far enough apart, it had to be a sighted shooting decision, so we were looking at how their eyes were engaged with their gun, how that affected their performance. We tested, there was 20-some officers, which is a fairly good number, much smaller than our other, but for the type of study is considered an adequate number for the study. We created a scenario, they acted on it, they responded. We gave them instructions. This was to be a shooting scenario because we were only concerned with shooting performance, and we were interested in the eye and motor performance and attention in the middle of that situation.
Would you please explain a little bit more about the scenario, about the stimulus, the go stimulus that you would essentially have, and how that was done?
Well, what we had was, we had, and if I could stand up and illustrate.
With the court's permission?
Go ahead.
Okay. We had an actor who had his back turned to the officer, and the actor at a point, and the scenario lasted for about a minute, but at the point began to raise their hand up as they reached for a gun in their waistband, stepped across, and began to come up. That is different than how we know individuals turn and assault an officer, but in this particular scenario, we wanted to look at did the raising of the elbow, did the turn affect anything? We presented the threat for enough time that officers who are very skillful really would know what, where, when, and how things were going to evolve, whereas regularly trained officers were just kind of trying to figure out what was going on. Good athletes know what, where, when, and how something's going to happen. That's a quote out of Vickers. And we find that good officers have the same type of training and sort of experience in the process. They're much more accurate in understanding the evolution of threat. And we found that expert officers recognize the elbow as being a distinct threat, tracked across the body, and were focused on the gun coming out on the other side. And if they were not focused on their sight picture, in other words, they didn't shift to make sure they had an accurate shot, they were not focused on their sight picture, they were focused on the threat. They then...
You're on this again, perception, which the court excluded out, and we're not talking about action and reaction time anymore, we're talking about something completely different in this study.
Any response, Mr. Robles?
In terms of describing the findings of the studies, would you please tell us about what you learned about shooting performance?
The officers who were reading the threat as it evolved, were able to make accurate decisions and respond precisely to the nature of the threat. And we actually had several times for each officer presented a cell phone, and the officers who were scanning, who were not looking at their sights but who were scanning, had much more accurate judgments and accurate shot.
Again, Your Honor, he's getting into the perceptions of officers, not action and reaction time, is what the court limited his testimony.
Mr. Robles, I'm trying to make the connection here as to the reaction time, and I'm having some problems.
The concern, I think, is that in order to understand what the ultimate time differences were between novice officers and elite officers, there needs to be the foundation for, okay, so what is the basis of comparison? There will come a time when Dr. Lewinsky will talk about the difference in terms of time, but in order to get there, just simply identifying the number just isn't going to make sense. And that's, essentially I'm working towards that without trying to talk about what officers see or don't see. Again, this is a scientific study about eye gaze, and that's being measured. It's not just simply a report back from the officers. It is a measure done by eye scan
Well,
device.
if we could get to the point about how quickly or not quickly experienced as opposed to non-experienced officers can bring something to their attention by the eye gaze, then that I'll allow you to go forward with that.
Given the court's guidance, would you please provide your response?
The officers who went to their guns and focused on their guns made a shot that was much later, especially if they were less skillful. The more well-trained officers were actually faster, more accurate in the shot, and other elements of the encounter.
Are you able to quantify the difference between the novice officer and the elite officer in terms of time?
Yes, sometimes the novice officers were second. I'd have to look at the stats, but I'm convinced that they were at least a second or more slower in their reaction time.
Okay. Now, what limitations, if any, did this study have?
Well, we didn't interview the officers after. We were looking solely at objective data. We could track it by eye scan. So we didn't rely upon them to tell us what. We might have interviewed them and compared their stated attention with the eye scan, but we were focused just on the eye scan and their decision process, in particular what they were doing with their eyes in relation to reading a situation and how they responded with their guns.
Now, I forgot to ask, is it correct to say that one of the items that the study measured was the time it takes to make the decision to shoot?
Yes.
Would you please explain your findings about the time it takes to make a decision to shoot?
It's much longer in a decision process as the threat evolves versus in our study. For instance, when hand came up, as obviously the officers were preparing. As the hand moved across and their guns came out, they came to a hold position, and they were ready. As the person turned, they were reading, and then as they saw the gun come around, they were very quick in their response. If they saw it was a cell phone, they were able to inhibit that response. That's a no-go response in relation to. So they were the whole evolution in an incident actually took much longer than a simple go-no-go decision making in our lab, because they had the threat evolve, and at some point in the threat they focused on a response, and that response was either perceiving and reacting or shifting to their guns, and when they shifted to their guns they took longer.
Okay. How much longer did officers take?
Well, overall, as I said, I need to look at the stats, but I think it's within easily a second longer or more. But some were less than a second.
How do the results of this study relate to real-life law enforcement setting?
Well, we know that officers who focus on their guns, it takes time for them to shift their gaze and to focus on their guns. That's a time frame issue. the military, looking at heads-up displays and time for that. You know, if you're flying at 700 miles an hour in a fighter plane, and you have to look down at your speed or whatever, and you look back up, it takes about 0.4 of a second. That's why military went to heads-up displays on their tools, is because you can look through your instrumentation and gaze at it, and gaze through it to the target. Well, we know that officers who shifted to their sight picture took a longer period of time than officers who simply focused and drove their lens through their gun through their line of gaze. So what they were doing had a significant effect on their response time, but also on their ability to see things.
So is it fair to say that it takes longer for an officer to acquire a sight, shoot sighted fire, than it does to simply point and shoot?
Objection, leaving.
I'll allow the question to be answered.
Yes, we've looked at several officer behaviors, and again, it's a complex area. We can't say that sight time per se takes this amount of time, because we know that a action, for instance, a gun held in this position and driven forward, if the officer simply points, it's at X quantity of time. If we add a sight picture to it and mandate the officer accurately shoot, so they have to get a sight picture, the average time it extends the officer's shooting response time is 18/100ths of a second, although we consistently get numbers in the realm of 1/4 to 1/3 of a second. And we assume that's because of the sighting process. Officers extending it out as they're being more accurate. We know that as an officer is extending a gun out, it's really different than simply pointing it, that the officer is really coming on target as they're required to be more accurate. That seems to interface with the visual part of the sight alignment. So it certainly, we know there's a lot of stuff going there, but when an officer tries to shoot accurately, it extends their time by approximately 1/3 of a second. We're very comfortable saying 18/100ths of a second for an average officer to acquire a sight picture.
What was the standard deviation of the study?
I don't remember that. I would have to look at the study itself.
I'm sorry.
It's really a small number, but I don't remember it precisely.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to the incident that is the subject matter of this case, and I'd like for you to briefly state the opinions that you have in this case.
In essence, if the officers are reacting as human beings do, as the officers that we have researched do, it takes time for them to engage. It takes time for them to do what they do. And during the time process, some of what they're going to do is going to delay or impair their ability to perceive and react to things.
Now, what have you reviewed in preparation for your testimony today?
I've reviewed a number of documents, but I think most relevant is the video.
Now, with the court's permission, we'd like to have just a moment to set up the laptop to be able to play what has been marked as Exhibit B3, the helmet camera video of Officer Pettis, which has been time-stamped.
Okay, has this previously been admitted or not?
No, by stipulation, the state has agreed to its admissibility. But I have not moved it into evidence, so at this time, based on the stipulation that the state has agreed to it, I'd like to move Exhibit B3 into evidence.
B3?
Yes.
Ms. Brigman, you have no objection?
No.
It will be
We have no objection, Your Honor. The question is, though, I thought the court had ruled he could talk generally about how it affects people. If he's now going to go through this and talk about what effect it's having on the officer at each stage of the proceedings, I do object to that, Your Honor.
As the court will see, we're not asking about effects. We have the science and the times that help us understand when, essentially, a decision was made to essentially when a go decision occurred, and how to look at the times that both studies have identified and factor them into the decision based on a review of the video. This is not a review of sworn testimony. This is not anything like that, or going into the officer's mind. This is simply taking the times which have been testified to and applying them to the video to help the finder of fact understand how these particular studies, which have not been challenged in any way, essentially apply to the video evidence.
Judge, as I have heard him testify, all of his studies were done on handguns and not rifles. And these are rifles that are already out on the shoulder, and all of his studies were done with handguns. So I think the timing of his studies is irrelevant to this particular case and doesn't even apply to this case.
As the court has heard, what's important is trigger pull. And what's being measured, and what was measured here, was the time it takes to pull a trigger. And that's the only thing that will be referenced in terms of, or that's, I guess, the one similarity that Dr. Lewinsky identified between both weapon systems, is that trigger pull is what's consistent.
And that shows on this video, is that what we're talking about, that you're about to play?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, I'll walk through very slowly. There's not going to be anything that is anything but applying the times that this court heard to a review of this video.
And just my objection is, Judge, it was for, and I think he didn't say it's just trigger pull as the timing. He also talked about pulling it up to aim and shoot. That came into their calculations of time on both these studies with the pistol to recognize the threat, pull it up and aim and shoot. That's not the situation we have here for any of these times, Judge. The situation we have here is an officer with the rifle, an AR-15 on his shoulder, ready to shoot, as opposed to pulling up a gun, a pistol, and shooting. And so the times from his studies don't apply to this situation, Judge.
Okay, well, my understanding was there was discussion and talk about the time it takes to pull the trigger and then to stop pulling the trigger, and that would be the same whether it be a handgun or a rifle. So I'll allow the defense to proceed with the video.
Okay. I need the VGA cable.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Podium VGA are we talking about?
Yes, Your Honor. Not podium, I'm sorry. The witness.
I think we can just plug.
Ah, there we go. Yep, thank you.
And it will be HDMI, Your Honor.
HDMI, I'm sorry.
All I have on here is witness, so that's the button.
Of course. Well, hopefully that works then, Your Honor. Thank you.
And then watch and see. Now, I would like to discuss how the results of your studies relate to the actions of Officer Pettis in this video. And I would like for you to make the following example. I would like for you to identify, or I should say, I would like for you to find the place in which you first begin to see Officer Pettis's muzzle flash.
I see what I believe to be the first muzzle flash at what is noted at 12.13 seconds, frame 000364.
So I'd like for you to assume that at this time and at that frame, that is the beginning point of your application, of your research to this video. So,
Okay.
hypothetically speaking, how much time based on your studies, how much time does it take for an officer to begin a trigger pull after receiving a go signal to shoot?
It's 4 to 6/100ths of a second for the actual trigger pull time itself.
Now, how many frames would that represent in the video?
That is 2 frames. We need to back this up by this much time. We're now at frame 00362 time 12.07 seconds.
How much time would it take for an officer to begin a trigger pull after receiving a go signal to shoot if he only had a simple decision to make?
If we're looking at a single instant on LED. It would take an officer a quarter of a second to begin to engage a trigger. It doesn't matter what they're using, it will take about a quarter of a second. But about the time it takes me to say, one, for the time frame for the brain and the eye to process things and send the motor signal down to the trigger and that confirmation to pull the trigger. And so that's about 8 frames. Each frame is 0.03. It's 3/100ths of a second. So we'll move this back by 8 frames for the clearest, simplest decision process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames.
Now, if this had been a complex decision, how much more time would it take an officer to make a trigger pull?
If we're looking at the average officer in a real simple situation where we have a go, no-go decision, so this is as simple as it can get, the range runs from 37/100ths of a second, which is another 12 frames, to 87/100ths of a second, with the average being 56/100ths of a second, including trigger pull. So we'll move this back 11 frames. There'll be a little extra here, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. If we look at 87/100ths of a second, which is a little slower and would involve maybe more complex decision-making process, we're looking at another, it's 87 minus 37, so we've got a half a second to deal with. As I calculated, divided by 3, we're looking at 20-some frames.
Okay.
So it's, let's say 3 into 5, 20, we're looking at 16 frames.
And excuse me, Judge, I am now lost because I don't know if he's saying it's 16 frames from the muzzle flash back or 20 frames. And this is nothing of what they talked to us about when we interviewed him and asked him what he was going to testify about it. So without having this in advance and being able to do the math about where he's getting these numbers and backing up the frames, he's just sort of throwing out numbers without us being able to cross-examine.
Well, I agree with the state. I'm getting confused as to why are we continuing to back up frames, because I don't know the reasons from the initial muzzle blast, and then explain why are we backing it up for each particular event.
Okay.
So if we were to go back to the initial muzzle flash, where you
Right.
see the muzzle flash, let's go back there.
Okay. There's the initial muzzle flash.
Now, there is an amount of time that it takes to make a simple decision, I should say, there is the time it takes to make a trigger pull.
That's correct.
And that's based on your Tempe study, is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
And how much time is that?
That's 6/100ths of a second for the average officer with an average short stroke light poundage trigger.
Now, I think maybe the confusion comes in here. How do you translate that time into essentially a movement of frames? That is, why do you back up the number of frames you do? So that you can explain for us the process, the math basically, the simple math of how you did that.
Right. Well, this is filmed at 30 frames, 29 point some frames per second. 30 frames a second is what it's considered to be at. And that's time stamped. Those frames are stamped on the image. And so if the time is at 12.13 seconds, it's 30 frames a second. Each frame is 0.03 seconds, approximately 0.02999. So it's 0.03 seconds. So if we're going to back it up by 6/100ths of a second, it's 2 frames back. 6/100ths of a second divided by 0.03 gives you 2 frames. If we're looking at 0.37, which is the lowest time, the shortest time it takes someone to make a decision, then you get 0.37 divided by 0.03, and you get 12.
Okay.
So you move it back by 12 frames. If you move it out to 87/100ths of a second, then it's divided by 0.03, and you're just about out to 30 frames.
Now, assuming that the decision was simple, how many frames would you go back?
Well, if we're looking at really 25 100ths of a second, which is what our average reaction time was to a simple instant on LED, you divide by 0.03 and you move back by 8 frames.
I'd like for you to do that at this time. Go ahead and
Okay. So if we look at, if a simple decision occurred, let's say we need to move it back for trigger pull. So we move it back for trigger pull, and then we move it back by 8 frames. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames. And that's the simplest, that's the time frame for the simplest decision possible.
okay. How
And
much
trigger pull.
How much time does complexity of the decision add to trigger pull?
Well, our really simple decision, go, no-go decision, runs at half a second, and I'll calculate this out as soon as I get a pen out of my pocket, make sure I'm accurate. The range is 0.37. If divide that by 0.03, that's 12 frames. If we go out to 87 100ths of a second divided by 0.03, that is almost 9 frames. And we'll say 8 frames to look for the calculation on the numbers, to accommodate for the numbers. So decision time will extend this range out by another 12 to 28 100ths of a second. Or frames, 12 frames to 28 frames.
Would you please back up that number of frames?
Okay. We need to, well, first of all, I've already gone out for a quarter second.
Okay.
So we need to go out for, let's say I went out 8 frames. I need to go out another 4 frames to get 12 frames, because we already backed it up 8 from trigger pull, because that 37 100 of a second involves trigger pull. So I'm going to back it up 8 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I'm going to, and that's the quickest response time.
Right.
If we go to an
Excuse me,
average,
Judge, because I thought you said after 8 frames, that was 8 frames plus the 2 for the trigger pull, that was the simplest response time. So he's losing me. I thought that's what he did before. He said 2 for the trigger pull, simple decision would be 8 more frames, so 10, and that's where we were, and now he's backing it up more, and I'm not following at all what he's doing. So.
There was the research on trigger pull, there was the research on simple decisions, and then there was the research on complex time. So we moved back systematically, taking into account the fastest that someone, I should say, assuming, making the assumption that this was a complex decision. Again, this is a hypothetical.
Mr. Robles, I think the easiest way for me to understand
I'm
it,
sorry.
okay, is, okay, I've seen what the simplest time is. Now, if we're going to do under a complex situation, if we then could go back to the beginning and then deduct those frames from that point under complex situation, because I'm getting the two confused here.
okay.
I apologize,
Okay.
Your Honor.
Good.
That would help me out a lot.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so as we enter complex decisions, it's the quickest complex decision is 0.37, and that's 12 frames back from this point.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. If we go to average, which is 56 100ths of a second, we need, and I'll go back, so we start at 12.03. So we divide 56 by 0.03, so that's, let's see, 3 into 5.
Excuse me, Judge, but we don't see the muzzle flash from where he's starting. That white light to the left is the flashlight is kept. There you go. There's the muzzle flash.
Okay.
Okay.
So then we have to go back and add trigger pull and then the complex decision, and we'll do that.
Okay. And so the average complex decision, we back up by 18 frames.
I just want to make sure you include trigger pull.
Trigger pull time. Right, so we're including trigger pull time here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. That's the average time. Okay, for the simplest complex decision, go, no go, pull the trigger when it's appropriate. We'll go back to the start time, trigger pull time, and there. And we'll go to 87 100ths of a second, which is, just want to make sure I'm accurate, it should be 28 frames. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28.
Based on your studies, how much time does it take for an officer to acquire sights?
Well,
Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm going to object because, again, the acquiring of the sights for all the studies he did were with pistols and not rifles, and that is significantly different.
Any response, Mr. Robles?
The question, again, I think it was explained by Dr. Lewinsky that, we're not taking into account weapon manipulation. We're talking about sighted fire. And again, there is no testimony that there's a difference between, and again, this is a hypothetical. This isn't a representation of what Officer Pettis did, so I want the court to be aware that, that there is an important distinction to be made here. But part of the study was how much time it took to acquire sights, and only the information from the study is being added in. And to the extent that the finder of fact thinks that there is a difference between acquiring sights on an iron-sighted weapon, a handgun, versus acquiring sights on an aiming system, that goes to weight, not to admissibility. And because and again, I can lay more of a foundation if you would like, but it seems to me that that's not about admissibility, it's simply about weight.
Anything else?
Judge, I think he testified and demonstrated for the court that the difference between rookie officers and experienced officers. So the second was because of this, of pulling the gun up, that there's time required to pull it out of your holster and pull it up to get sights with a pistol that you don't have in this particular situation where somebody has the rifle already on their shoulder.
Because the witness had previously said there's not much of a difference at all, I agree with the defense. It goes to weight, not necessarily the admissibility, and you can certainly cross-examine him on that.
we know that trigger pull and sight can both be involved with other things, but sighting does take a particular discrete amount of time, attentional time. As I said, when it involves movement as a weapon, it slows down things, and that's why we're out to a third of a second. But when we have someone fire and keep acquiring the sight picture, that also has an effect. So we know that if the officer sighted in this time span, the sight time would be added to the total time of the behavior. So it doesn't matter what we found, we know the time to begin to make the decision, acquire the sight, and respond is going to occur earlier than what we have currently on the frame in the picture.
How much time did your studies reveal about the time it takes for an officer to acquire his or her sights?
If the officer is maintaining the sight as they're doing something, that will take 2, 3, that frames. If the officer actually actively acquires the sight, we'll move out another, we'll move out another 3 frames, because I said it's 18 100ths of a second. So there is a period. That would be where a simple decision is made. The officer pulls the trigger and acquires their sight during the time span. and that's from simple laboratory studies involving non-stress conditions.
What effect would it have, what did your studies reveal about the effect that stress would have on a decision to essentially acquire your sights and use and fire your weapon?
What our latest study is telling us, the one published in the American Psychological Association Journal, is that an officer who's active, who's responding, is going to process less information about what's going on because of the stress. And that's going to mean their response is driven by decisions that they've made at the time, and likely is going to extend their decision process, particularly in a more complex dynamic environment where they have to perceive. It's not a simple go, no-go. They have to perceive and understand and then make a decision. That tends to elongate the decision. That's an unknown at this point. I have to say it's unknown. It depends on the complexity of the decision process.
Based on your research, are you able to conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether there was a time lapse between the decision to shoot, whenever that may have been, and the actual time to shoot as seen in the video?
If these officers are human beings, there is a time delay.
Excuse me, Your Honor. Again, that's what the court said he couldn't do. He couldn't do it with this video. He couldn't say, was there a lag from this video with this officer? I think the court said he could talk about his research, but he couldn't apply it to this particular case.
Any response?
The question I asked about, essentially, again, applying the research and being able to reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific probability that in this case, because we start with the proposition that Officer Pettis is a human, that all of his findings apply to him, so that this court would be put in the position to then essentially take those findings from the research and apply them to this situation and draw its conclusions about what the conclusions mean for the finder of fact.
I'll allow it as it goes, I think, to the weight of the evidence. Go ahead.
Based on your research, are you able to conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether there was a lapse in time between the decision to shoot, whenever that may have been, and the actual shot seen here in the video?
Yes, and that lapse of time would take some time, and it's approximately about a second or so. And that's characteristic of all human performance. Decision-making, cognitive issues, including affirming vision and reaction time, are characteristic of all humans in every encounter.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor?
Sure.
I don't have any questions at this time, but I'd like to indulge, if I can indulge the court for a break for my
So
own
what
personal
time is
needs.
it now?
It's 20 to 12, Your Honor.
Okay. If no one has any objection, I'm assuming they won't, we could break for lunch now and be back at about 10 after 1.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. We'll be in recess until 1:10.
All right.